Public-private partnerships and innovation for sustainable development. And I'm requesting the speakers and Chair Dr. Arvind Mayaram to please come on stage. So moving on from our last session, which was on policy and regulatory uncertainty, now we are discussing a critical area on how public-private partnerships need to be creative enough and to be innovative enough to work for people. So, it is a wonderful panel here, which will be chaired by Dr. Arvind Mayaram, who is Chairman Cuts Institute for Regulation and Competition. And I welcome Sebastian Morris, who is Professor, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. We also welcome Sharmila Chawale, former Joint Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, Government of India. And Shri Prasanna Srinivas, who is a Senior Consultant and Infrastructure Expert in Public-Private Partnerships. So the aim of this session is to discuss how innovation with regard to public-private partnerships have responded to crucial developmental challenges in area of social, human, and sustainable development. I'm over to Dr. Arvind Mayaram. I'm requesting Dr. Arvind Mayaram to take proceedings ahead. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Saket. Ladies and little time on an area which has emerged in a very big way, the format in which a lot of public infrastructure and infrastructure services, including social infrastructure services, are being delivered all over the world. Public-private partnerships, if we really look at them closely, are those kind of arrangements, contractual arrangements, in which the private sector often mobilizes its finances and also its managerial capabilities to create public infrastructure assets and also to deliver public services. Now, when we say public infrastructure or public services, we are speaking about those where for a very long time the state or the public sector was responsible and had been making its efforts to reach out to people. But in many areas we have seen that either the quality of infrastructure or the quality of services have not been of the level which would really provide the kind of service that is expected by the people. And we must also remember that we are now in an age of rising expectations, and which creates its own kind of social crisis. UNECE has given some estimates, but there are various estimates, UN estimates and other estimates. But broadly speaking, in the Agenda 2030, which is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN has assessed there would be a need to invest $110 trillion for infrastructure to provide those basic services which are required for good life. And if it was to be green infrastructure, it will go up to $115 trillion. So that's the kind of money which is required. Taken together in terms of the surpluses available with various governments, especially in developing countries, and also the public financing institutions, multilaterals for instance, World Bank and other banks which have come up, the total amount which would be available is far short of what is going to be required. And we must also remember the capacity of the state to borrow is also shrinking. The need to keep deficits in check is now increasingly felt. We are no longer living in an area where you can have large deficits to do public expenditure. Now, in this light, there is one very important aspect which also emerges, which is the input of a technological implosion which is happening in terms of innovation, in terms of in the form of the new ways in which to do things. And this technology which is coming in a very rapid manner, and we had heard some speakers in the morning speak about the changes which are happening so rapidly. The mastering of technology or harnessing of technology, harnessing of innovation to improve delivery or improve services becomes extremely important when it comes to public services. And in that sense, public-private partnerships also then plug into one very critical aspect, which is the aspect of bringing the state-of-the-art or above, ahead of the curve technologies into infrastructure or delivery of services. This also is important from the point of view of integrating a large number of services. In the governments, for instance, earlier and even today, the delivery of services or creation of infrastructure is responsibility of specific departments or agencies. And therefore, if you look at construction of road, which would be with, say, Ministry of Road Transport, you will have port construction, which will be with Ministry of Shipping and Ports. Civil aviation is with the airports. Railways is another ministry. Health and education are other aspects of it. But when you look at many places, integration of several of these together, and we were just talking a little while ago outside in terms of, for instance, inland waterways transportation. How do you, to connect all of these together, what is required again is provided in the form of public-private partnerships by a private partner who becomes the integrator of public services which cut across various departments or agencies. So today, we will be speaking about how the public-private partnership format becomes critical in this aspect. And I must add, before I introduce a very eminent panel here today with me, one other factor which is perhaps often missed, which is public-private partnership. And we have with us for, today Ms. Sharmila Chawli, who has done tremendous work in the area of public-private partnerships from the policy level as in the Finance Ministry in Government of India, who perhaps will also bring this aspect in. If the public-private partnerships are managed in the manner in which they are expected to be managed, which is in terms of the procurement process being followed, which is transparent, they also promote competition in an area which otherwise has been beset by a lot of problems of deals which create other kind of problems. So today we have, and first of all, I would request Professor Morris. Professor Sebastian Morris, who's professor in the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, has one of the pioneers. In fact, I remember my first interaction with him on public-private partnership sometimes in the late 90s. He has been a pioneer in this area. He did a lot of original work on public-private partnerships, theoretical work on public-private partnerships, which has been the bedrock of a lot of other things which happened. And I must say that my initiation in public-private partnerships at the theoretical level began with my interaction with Professor Morris. So today we have a person who has really seen it happen from the beginning, who would be also making a keynote to get the discussion rolling. As I mentioned, Sharmila Chabli, who's joint secretary, who was joint very recently, till very recently, joint secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs and Ministry of Finance, was anchoring for the last 5 years the entire PPP framework for India, has done tremendous work both in the area of creating new financing, innovative financing instruments like INVITs and IDFC, the infrastructure debt funds, and also has worked of very recent on municipal bonds to get civic infrastructure going. So she will bring in the policy or government perspective, the macro perspective on PPPs. On my right is a practitioner, Prasanna Srinivas. I think one of the finest brains I have worked with in the last 10 years or more in terms of structuring of PPPs, what can get PPPs to work. A person who's worked as morely in the area of consultancy, but with tremendous amount of insight into how public-private partnerships can work. And so I have now 3 perspectives here, clearly from government policy perspective, the academic perspective in how the entire discipline of PPP has evolved and is working, and then the practitioner from the private sector side, consultancy side, as to how structuring, etc., can really be done, keeping in mind 2 themes that we are looking at: innovation and competition, which must come from the processes that are followed. So I will request, first of all, Professor Morris to speak, to make a small keynote address, and then I will ask Prasanna also to do the other part, which is the more difficult part, which is moderating the session and also keeping the time, so that some of us, especially people like me who are given to speaking too much, can be held back. So, Professor Morris.
Honor and to be here, presenting my views and my understanding of PPPs. Thanks to Dr. Arvind Mayaram and to CUTS for inviting me to be here. Yeah, before I start off with the main points which Dr. Arvind Mayaram raised, I would like to bring to your notice the situation with regard to PPPs. Okay, have PPPs become public-private pain? Okay, so has the model really broken? Okay, apparently the evidence is to that, because vast NPAs of banks, and quite a bit of that is built up on infrastructure, and a significant part of that actually happened in PPPs. Okay. Now, in contrast, when I retreat back and look at what the expectations were with the 12th plan, okay, at that time India thought that, the Planning Commission thought that we would be doing more PPPs than any other country in the world. And for 2 reasons. One is that our infrastructure and social development was ambitiously presented. And the other reason is that we quite recognized the difficulties of the state at the lower level in terms of organizational capacity to manage even simple EPCs and procurement, like buying a good road off the shelf. Okay. So given those limitations, obviously the role of PPPs in India was expected to be very, very high. That, along with the huge projections based on a 9% kind of growth, led to this understanding. So we have gone nowhere near that level. Okay, but nevertheless, I think the role of PPPs have increased in society, despite all the problems that have come up with regard to their design structure and the place that they fit in. And what I'll do is I'll go through that, to bring out, in a sense, the core, difficulties in our design. Okay. In power, as you know, there is a huge overcapacity. Although the solar commitment has been pushed up, real delivery of solar is likely to push up the unit costs quite significantly because of the load that it places on transmission when you do it in a vanilla model. Okay, so what we are trying to do is we are trying to bring solar into a model of managing the electricity system, which is essentially, which is essentially archaic, okay, and meant for something else, meant for a vertically integrated monopoly. In fact, we are trying to bring about a kind of regulation on which is okay for a vertically integrated monopoly, but not really for a market or for a fragmented system. Okay. Now, the NHAI has fixed some part of the problem by coming out with the hybrid annuity model, as you all know. Okay, but you know, the possible problems with the same may just unfold in the years to come, because what it does is it increases the contract failure risk in a certain kind of situation. Okay, not right now, but as it could come. Again, the coal and allocation problem with regard to natural resources, which were again sought to be done through the development was sought to be done through the private sector, entered into big time problem with the previous government. In a sense, it was fixed afterwards. But if you really look at the fix, okay, the probability of squatting continues. Okay, now this is very important, because right now we are not worried about the problem of squatting because of an overcapacity, as well as no great hurry to develop the coal right now given the industrial recession. Okay, but as and when growth picks up, it's unlikely that squatting would not happen. And there are certain provisions in the contract, or missing provisions in the contract, actually in the policy, which actually creates this. Okay, and the less said the better about municipal infrastructure. Almost no development in water, sewerage, sanitation, municipal roads. Okay, Veolia Water, a French company, after having demonstrated 24/7.
भाई आप इधर बाहर चले जाइए जो बात कर रहे थे.
Sorry, this disturbs me. Okay, yeah. Veolia Water, after having developed near 24/7 with the same amount of input water in Karnataka as a good model, it was tried to be extended to Delhi. Okay, but it could not be for a variety of reasons. Again, which depended on the structuring of the PPP and the associated policy, and therefore Veolia Water, in a sense, has kind of reduced its commitment in the country, and they have just now one city where they seem to be interested. Garbage piles and sewerage remain part of the urban habitat in India. They are worsened quite considerably, and today the only way in which finally the garbage is handled is either you burn it or it just decays, and sewerage is less than 100% in all parts of India. And if sewerage is, even at 90%, sewerage is inadequate, because the remaining 10% means that people do it out in the road, and the disease burden therefore is enormous. So India continues to be the country with the highest morbidity in the world, thanks to a kind of approach to sewerage, which all I can say is quixotic, because if there is any benefit at all in subsidizing, the highest value that you can get in subsidizing would be to subsidize drinking water and sewerage, because unless these go 100%, there is a huge burden which the rest of society pays. People who are even connected pay. Okay. Now, why has all this happened? And what could be the solution? Partly in our critique itself would be the solution. Okay. Now, I would argue that unlike what is generally believed, okay, though I have changed that position somewhat, okay, is that much of the reasons, much of what needs to be done lie more in policy, frameworks, formats, and creating organizations, and not so much in the political class or the difficulties which emanate from the political class. Though I will, kind of moderate this statement by saying that, look, the political class or the system does not provide opportunity every time for the wise or the motivated civil servant to carry out reforms, or to do what is right, or to correct what was wrong. But typically when there is a crisis, the opportunity presents itself. And it's at that time, if the civil servant and his group and policy makers, I would put it, if they have the right format and the correct thing, then they can drive a coach and four through to great positive effect on the economy, as it once happened in the case of the NHDP, NHAI, which started off with the golden quadrilateral. Okay? So what I would say is that most of these problems are actually eminently correctable, and the corrections lie within us. Okay? Now, I do accept that a lot of the failure of, let us say, infrastructure and of banks cannot be attributed to merely infrastructure, because the economy was pushed into a recession, and the cyclical aspect does explain a lot of the NPAs. But even then, there is a fairly significant role for the NPAs which came because of the bank's poor understanding of infrastructure finance and of the design of PPPs. Okay? See, essentially the problem is that in public-private partnerships of long duration, where there is a fixed price contract through which the person earns, okay, which he can't change, for instance, a toll road or an annuity. An annuity is fixed in both volume as well as implicit price. Toll road is fixed in terms of price. Okay. When financing is done, he can't take interest rate risk. Okay. The developer simply cannot be asked to take the interest rate risk. Okay. Now, the one thing which was missing in the policy was a compulsion to internalize the interest rate risk, which would have made all the developers go to the IDFC and such other organizations which have takeout financing and they cover the interest rate risk to cover themselves and come forward. Obviously, this would have raised the cost a little bit, but you would have killed two birds with one stone. You would have, repelled you would have avoided adverse selection. Okay? Because today in PPPs, if the policies go slightly wrong or if they're not quite right, you will crowd in the kind of people whom you don't want. Okay? So I think it's very important in India to cover the interest rate risk compulsorily in PPPs, especially because bond markets don't exist beyond, let's say, 15 years. And there is a tendency among developers to politically manage this risk because they can know, and they feel this because on the one side there is government which is pliable in their thinking, and on the other side there are the banks, and the public sector banks being what they are, they can dump all the crap on them, okay, when the problem arises. So this freedom kind of brings in the wrong kind of parties into PPPs. So that needs to be fixed, and the best way to really fix it at, I would think, not more than 1% of the project cost would be to have policies in PPP formats which necessarily internalize the cost of covering the interest rate risk. Okay. The second issue is really much more fundamental. Okay. That is, there is very little clarity within the thinking among public leaders, including policy makers.
2 minutes, Professor Paras, 2 minutes more.
Okay, sure. On what is better regulated or set as, entities which need to be regulated, and what is to be covered as PPPs. Typically, one would think that when there is a dual market failure, namely there is an appropriability risk, there's an appropriability problem, and it's a natural monopoly, you would go in for, PPPs. The third point is that subsidization still remains nonsensical. You subsidize use rather than access. Any economist anywhere all the time have advised us that we should subsidize access rather than use. And direct subsidies, which the Modi government has introduced as an idea, is wonderful, but needs to be operationalized in the context of electricity and several other sectors. Okay. We often make the statement that that vested interests stand in the way, but I would beg to differ. Actually, poor policy and design, okay, creates the space for vested interests. And then the vested interests emerge to keep policy as such, to realize, revenues. Good examples would be, let's say the airport privatizations, which created vast rents in a sense, and then the court had to strike down, which could have been actually anticipated. The third is, of course, frontier area, which is design issues in sectors. While we are, yes, investing fairly successfully on roads and so on, there is absolutely no idea of layouts of roads, that roads must integrate with land use, that hierarchy must be adhered to in the design of road systems, and that roads must go on to grid networks rather than star networks in an economy like ours. So even though the PMGSY is rolling out a lot of village roads and so on, what is actually happening is that the tremendous public value which you could have got out of the investments, that is being cheated out. Okay, that is being removed, subtracted because of the poor design. If you look at the national highways, they are great. I mean, they are certainly an improvement over the past. But India has the world's highest accident rate among major countries, and the rate is some 15 times higher than that of the comparable countries. The reason being that the roads are designed as death traps. Most of the accidents can be traced to road geometrics. Okay? So the challenge of road geometrics is very high. It's very intuitive, but the Indian Roads Congress is not the body to handle it. Okay? So this is a general design issue. I won't get into the various sectors for lack of time. But now I'll talk about strategizing public value. Okay? And here, let me take the example of the Golden Quadrilateral. Okay? Because this is something which is workable. When things look dismal, let's look at what has worked in India, at least worked to a great extent. I mean, there is a lot which one can desire. What happened is Prime Minister then announced that he would build a road from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. But the ministry at that time, instead of literally interpreting it as this happens today on Swachh Bharat or smart cities or whatever, went and understood this more functionally as let's liberate India's highways. And they had a ready plan in the form of the NHDP with its own road fund, its own land acquisition act, its own improved EPC format, its own BOT, and an innovation, namely an annuity format. Okay? And they were able to push this through. And it happened so well that the next government had only one choice, namely to support it. Okay? So when you have a creative exercise which is essentially intellectually correct and administratively feasible, and in terms of public value, contributing, then the impact that it has on the society is huge. Remember, even today, for the government of the day, the only worthwhile thing to put public money on is still the GQ and still the NHDP. You put money on smart cities, you put money on the other things, you know that it's going to go dead. Okay? Because there is no similar integrated public value creating processes. Okay? Price distortions are there, but I won't talk about it. The answer is direct subsidies. Now, what is the problem? The problem is, as a society, as a government, we put very little emphasis on organizations, organizational capability, on incentive compatibility within organizations, in our policy, in our regulation. Okay? Society itself has poor capability in that sense, but I don't blame that. Then where technical skills are required, persons not necessarily, great people but not necessarily the right persons are in place. So if we say that the government of India is above the laws of economics and management, then we are going to lose. Okay. Have we come to a point where we are saying the government of India is above the laws of economics and management and also physics and chemistry? Then bigger disasters are awaiting. Okay. So I have been provocative for a purpose, that is to invite some counter to this position that I hold. Thank you.
I'm going to request Ms. Sharmila Chavali now to make her presentation on what are some of the innovative aspects, especially within the government system, that can help move this process along as part of whatever it is that you are presenting. Say, let's look at about 10 to 12 minutes as a general guideline. I shall hassle you after 10 and 12 minutes.
Good afternoon, and please excuse my raspy throat. First of all, thank you to CUTS and to Dr. Mayaram for inviting me to participate in this. And before I get into what Prasanna has asked me for, I just want to tell Professor Morris, just like in the laws of physics, like water bureaucrats also tend to find their own level. So whichever post you're in the end, you end up doing something that you're supposed to be doing. I just want to talk about a couple of things in the context of what the keynote speaker just said and what Prasanna asked me. Have there been problems with PPPs in India? Yes, they have. But beyond that is the tremendous success that we've seen. And this is important both in terms of innovation and in terms of what other countries and other regimes can learn. Because one of the most successful things we can pick up from a country or any other, any jurisdiction is what not to do. And I think Professor Morris just mentioned it. When strategy precedes rollout, there is a success. I don't want to elaborate too much on this, but Dr. Mayaram was the architect of the PPP rollout in India, that is across the country, which started in the mid-2000s. Today, India is ranked number 1 in operational maturity in PPPs by the Economist Intelligence Unit, number 2 or number 3 in, I think, readiness for PPP. There are 3-4 indicators. You can check that. This is a 3-year exercise that is done by the EIU very quietly. We are ranked among the top. Why is this? Look at the sectors where PPPs have proliferated. Roads and ports for the most part. Professor Morris spoke about the problems in banks. There is a general tendency to conflate infrastructure assets with PPPs. Not all infrastructure assets are PPPs. So far, all the PPPs have been in infrastructure. The sectors where we've done a lot of PPPs, roads and ports, are very different from, say, the power sector. Not many PPPs. The plain vanilla PPPs are very few in that. They have had some historical problems, not related to this, including one where I think Professor Morris has done pioneering research that is on land, the land acquisition for infrastructure. In areas where we have done well, let's go to the largest, that is roads. Professor Morris just spoke about it. Go to the period in the early, I think 2012 to 2011 to 2013, when there was this very shrill criticism of how PPPs have failed, road sector, endemic problems, etc. In terms of numbers, I could be off by about a couple of digits, but out of about 400 roads PPPs, the ones that actually failed, which could not move forward, were 65 or 67. Out of them, and we have done this in detail, the Rangarajan committee also has gone into this in detail, out of this, about 30 or 31 were purely because of the cussedness of the public sector, that is us, where we just dug in our heels and we said we refuse to open our eyes. The balance, and that is, I think, about 34 to 35, were because of problems in the private sector. Very little is said about that. The private sector had over-leveraged at the parent company level. They went in for very aggressive bidding. And in a PPP, because you do life cycle costing, it becomes very difficult for the public servant to say that the bid which has been received is unworkable, which you can do in standard rate contracts that we do or EPC. So you accept this, and it becomes too late later to say, hey, this is not workable, which is when these people started screaming, when the economy started going bad. Dr. Mayaram has this favorite line which he uses. He structured the rollout at the time when we thought that the good times would never end. The economy was almost approaching double-digit GDP growth rates. People were moving, traffic was multiplying faster than we could imagine. Our structures in the rollout were built for a time when there was a fairly strong amount of rigidity. In government, we go by the law, and the basic law is you can't do post-award contractual changes. This affects the transparency and can also lead the government to end up in litigation, the moral hazard. But what we did is we built up model contractual documents which did not lead to any flexibility for some things, in George Bush's terms, the unknown unknowns. Who knows what is going to happen over 30 or 60 years? Is there any flexibility that we can build in without in any way impairing the financials of the basic bid out of the project? Pioneering research has been done by Jose Luis Huash in South America on this. He's written a beautiful book on renegotiation of PPP contracts. Everyone cites that book. Very few people read it through to the last chapter, where the last line says, or I think the last page says, do not renegotiate contracts. We have learned from that. We had called Mr. Huash to India. We have now come up with triggers in long-term contracts which allow renegotiation between partners, provided this does not affect the baseline financials on which the bid was awarded. It's available on the website of the DEA. You're free to take this up. In terms of knowledge sharing, what we've been doing is we've been interacting with countries in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and South America, and pro bono exchanging our experiences with them. And we've come up with a very good online forum where it's a very healthy interaction that we have. We encourage you to go to our website and learn from that. The reason I say this is because our successes have also been built upon the knowledge we have picked up across the country. India is a very large country. The successes in some areas haven't been replicated elsewhere. But then again, the three things that have succeeded is again what Professor Morris referred to: policy, framework, and organizational structure. What we've done in India is, and this is in the DA under Dr. Mayram, we have rolled out capacity building across the country. There is no constraint on finances that are available for providing expert advice to policymakers. Most important, we have something called a pilot program, pilot PPPs, which very little is known about. We experiment with PPPs. We come back to waste to energy, civic services. We have rolled out two excellent structures, one for one ward of Mumbai and another for a Maharashtra hill station, where in the first one, waste was going to be converted to energy. We got stuck because there was a political problem, there was some change in the political, so the mayor wanted some changes. This happens. Once we test out a pilot and it succeeds, we then standardize documents and roll them out. We have done this in things like silos and grain management. We are right now trying it in health and education. We hope this succeeds. We're also doing tremendous work in new instruments for financing. Our biggest successes have been in devising market instruments which we have launched successfully for long-term financing of debt and rollover of takeout of equity. The infrastructure debt funds and the infrastructure investment trusts, IDFs and INVITs. They have been launched in the market. The IDFs have built up huge portfolios, I think over $500 million worth of portfolios in the last 2.5 years. They're ready to list on the Singapore Stock Exchange. It didn't make sense for them to go earlier because it was better in India. The market was much better in India. INVITs have started slowly. They aggregate good projects with a few under construction projects where the risk is high, and they help recycle of equity. The last thing that we did is something Dr. Mayram had spoken about, municipal bonds. Municipal bonds have been there in the past, but the new type of municipal bond we have got is municipal bonds for infrastructure financing, which is, the underpinning is just 5 simple things. 1, have ring-fenced projects. Ideally PPP, but even if not, have ring-fenced projects so that there's a finite end, you know when the project is going to start and when it's going to end. 2, the municipality should have very, very transparent accounts which are put out on the net. We have worked with the regulator. There's a 6-monthly disclosure required. 3, you have to ensure that when you go out to issue the bonds, there should be a story. There should not be a one-off. No investor is going to engage with the municipality for just a one-time investment, especially the overseas long-term investors. So have a shelf of projects which are going to be rolled out. 5, ensure that you escrow the revenues of these, for these projects so that the investor has the certainty and there's no regulatory risk in some of the monies being taken away or made fungible. These have helped. Pune had the first issuance which is listed on stock exchange. It's happened in June. We have about, we just do the rollout, we did the rollout from the Ministry of Finance. After that it's up to the municipalities to do it. We have about 10 municipalities lining up to do this in future. The last part I want to come to is, Professor Morris spoke about some of the problems. This comes from rigidity in the government, and also a reluctance to accept that if we are involved, there's no arm's length distance between regulation in a sector and the government. There tends to be the overhang where I think in the previous session someone said that the regulatory capture by the government is very risky for the private partner. We have been encouraging, and the Kelkar committee has spoken about this, we have been encouraging independent regulation, and a lot of you may be aware of this. When ex-bureaucrats become regulators, they suddenly take on a new avatar. They become even more aggressive against government than the private sector. And most of the cases, even in the judges, when the cases go to litigation, they go against the government. But independent regulation in most sectors is already there. The second part where India has had a problem is in dispute resolution. This can be interminable. I read in the paper that something the Ministry of Finance had worked on for the last 4 years, changes to the Arbitration Act to have a special carve-out for dispute resolution in infrastructure.
2 minutes.
In PPPs and infrastructure is moving forward. That's almost ready. The second is something called, what we have in India, the Specific Relief Act. The Specific Relief Act enabled freezing of projects which are under dispute. That a project where the contractor and the government had a problem would just get frozen. They wouldn't be implemented. The finance minister, one of the first things on his agenda was, let's review this. So I read 2 days ago in the papers that the changes we had proposed to the Specific Relief Act, the Ministry of Law and Justice will be taking this forward. This will help a potential investor in PPPs actually understand what the problem is and also the risks in a dispute. The last thing I want to come on to is in terms of innovation and competition. Dr. Mayaram had spoken about how competition has helped bring in best practices in a lot of projects. We also find that there's a tremendous amount of innovation coming in. We've introduced a new infrastructure rating for infrastructure projects in India, the first of its kind in the world, and some of them are offering green tagging also of such rating, which will go side by side with the regular rating of a corporate rating of a project. What happens in this is, when you are building in these structures, one of the things that companies are looking into is sustainable practices in project design and project implementation. This can add up to 4% in terms of project cost in the terms of at the times of construction. But simultaneously in life cycle costs, it saves about 12 to 15%. This is one of the things we are seeing in certain sectors, but this is brought in entirely by the private sector itself, which is for us a tremendous learning, it was a wonderful thing to learn for us. I'll stop here, and Prasanna, because I'm running out of time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions on both the successes and the few failures we've had in PPPs. The failures have actually been a good test of the market, because if there are no failures, then I from the government will worry that we're giving away too much to the private sector. That is why there are no failures.
Thank you so much, Sharmila. Just to capture some of the points made by the presenters, I think Dr. Morris spoke about a strategic vision through the example of the Kanyakumari to Kashmir road project being translated into a workable operational plan that made sense in the economic and commercial context in the country, which sort of led to a fairly successful National Highway Quadrilateral program. Sharmila spoke about several aspects of systems within government that have changed and done quite well in the Indian context for PPPs. One is introducing a level of flexibility in structures of contracting as well as in legal resolution of problems, because it's quite inevitable when you're trying these new things, you've done into problems. Active program of capacity building, including providing funds to local and state governments to conceive and roll out programs, including a provision of pilot projects. This is pretty critical because many of these things are new in the sense they're not being tried in a commercial framework and could fail. New financial instruments. No, it is being tried in a commercial framework, but it could run into all kinds of roadblocks, and it's not a guaranteed success. And also in terms of changes in legal and arbitration act and so on and so forth, all of which are helping to create an environment where You can conceive with a strategic view and implement with a level of flexibility over for a 30 or 40-year program. Before I hand over to Dr. Mayram, I'm going to take a few minutes on just a few points that I had listed down. Many of these actually come from projects or programs that I've been part of teams that have actively worked on. Some of the examples of when PPPs have worked have been typically, from our point of view, a plain vanilla project. So when I'm building a road user is more likely than not going to have the ability to pay for a toll, provided it's not outrageous. Just the transport cost and fuel alone on a per kilometer basis will justify an extra tax for usage of the road. Where life gets a little complicated is when you're dealing with a set of services that you don't have paying ability amongst communities, or there is a reluctance to pay because the service levels are so terrible. Just to give you an example, one problem that a lot of people have faced even with water supply projects in India, in cities, and there have been a few PPPs rolled out, is people are not used to paying for water to a government system. So the minute you get pricing as a bundle of your water supply service, there is a reluctance to pay. And very frequently these projects initially see a huge dip in demand for water because it's now priced. And B is also a lot of political resistance to why are we paying so much. Now in practice, I live in Bangalore, where in general infrastructure and civic amenities are terrible. And about half the city is run on private tankless supply. You drop a borewell in your plot, and the lane where I live, it's a middle class locality. There are 4 households who've got borewells that fill up tankers supplying water every day. And this is a locality that includes residents who are employees of some of our leading IT firms. Bangalore is an IT city and so on. So this is not a poor locality. There are people paying a lot of money to get that water, but they will not pay it to the government. So the problem is, governments don't have enough money to provide for a variety of these services right now because they can't create the infrastructure. That is a real financial constraint. Roughly, governments are broke or do not have the money out of their current revenues. The 2 routes that they can go is, one is they could borrow that money, or you could go through PPP route. Let me just explain the difference. Now, governments have been borrowing. There are limits on government borrowing, which will turn up in macroeconomic statistics and so on. But that money goes back to the same management that thus far has been, for reasons of a system, I'm not blaming the people concerned, not accountable. The last month and a half, I think Bangalore city alone, citizens groups have gotten pretty active about at least a half a dozen people killed in road accidents in the city because the quality of the road has been so terrible. Now, we can't take the government on a consumer liability case. Now, if this happened in a shopping mall, you'd happily take it and probably have a couple of people sent to jail as a means of, let me correct this, forget the politics of it. You don't have that recourse for the government. Now, what a PPP affords more easily is you do have recourse to, do I get the service or don't I get the service? For example, if you are consuming your mobile phone services, you have recourse to it. The second big upside is, one is of course you have management that is more accountable, therefore hopefully they'll do better. The second thing is that there is an upside to the borrowing. In effect, the annuity contract, Professor Morris, that you described in a road contract, is also like repayment of a loan of some sort. Now the upside on the annuity contract is if the road actually drives in more traffic than you anticipated, the government in effect reduces its borrowing because it's going on a citizen payment. So in some sense, financially it's a risk worth considering depending on which sector you can take as opposed to plain borrowing. Now, a few aspects that make a huge difference in terms of do these programs work well or don't. The one aspect I'll talk about is integration of government. About 3 or 4 years ago, I did some review of urban planning in, doing some work with the IDFC Foundation. And yet again, I was confronted with the reality that, say, in a city like Bangalore, which I took as a case in point because I live there now, there are about 6 or 7 different agencies that have versions of an urban plan, an urban transport plan, a master plan, a strategic vision, blah, blah, blah. I've probably forgotten some words, but it's a long list of institutions with a long list of plans, all regarding the same geography. At least one of those institutions, I think this was, it's on the website, so I can quote them. I think there's a town and country planning council. Actually said, you know, the unfortunate thing is nobody has to pay attention to our master plan because it's not required by law. They got it up front on their website. Now, what this strikes me is, apart from the wastage of a lot of capabilities that are going into producing things that no one uses, is the fact that you have many overlapping jurisdictions on the same thing. To give you a contrasting example, about 2 years ago in Australia, this is something I happened to research, and it's happening in a couple of other places around the world. They are measuring their urban transport planning by way of outcomes on commuting time for a citizen to your place of work, to your school, to your college. And they, of course, they're conducting anecdotal researches to support it and saying, is our urban transport policy working? One is in terms of course, reducing the level of pollution and motorized transport and so on, which is part of the environmental goals. The others is commuting time actually becoming more predictable and effective. Now, we have none of that happening here. You have the metro rail comes under the Ministry of Railways. Sometimes it's a state government implemented program. The city bus transport comes under the municipal corporation of the city. And very often you will find, like you did, for example, even in Delhi, you have metro lines that don't have feeder services going to a locality. So people aren't using the train because they can't get to the station or get back from it. So integration of government is a big thing. Often this integration also involves serious money. I think 10 years ago, Dr. Maharam, if you recollect, when we were working on the Pura project, which is the provision of urban amenities to rural areas, it's been now recast as urban, as in rural amenities as in urban areas. I forget the full form. There were about 4 different schemes within a single ministry, namely the Ministry of Rural Development, that were available for various facets of infrastructure, administered by 4 different departments, who, if they happened to be talking together, it was more because the people concerned talked. It wasn't an systematized integration of efforts. I can guarantee that, this is a pretty informed and intelligent set of people here. If I picked 5 of you and told you, here are 10 crores every year to make something happen in District A, some serious things will happen because you know what you'd like to do, you have the money in one place and you can do it. So integration of government, I do believe, is one big area that can help towards making projects move more quicker and, more importantly, have direct measurable outcomes. So as a citizen, I feel something is gained. My gain is not that I have a deadly metro network in my city. My gain is that I have a comfortable commute that is affordable. And that's the mindset shift that is required. The other aspect that can work a lot in terms of structuring PPPs is, highway projects are sexy projects. It's a 1,000 crore, $1 billion bids, big contracts. Government departments love it. Now, just last year, I was working with a team in Tamil Nadu which is looking at completing the cycle of Swachh Bharat mission funds. Swachh Bharat, briefly put, provides enough money for you to construct your toilet. Now, what is normally happening is, therefore, I put the toilet pot and the waste goes into the ground, into, within quotes, unknown. Nobody really knows. The only way you can check it is actually put a stick down there, and it's too expensive because there's roughly, say, Trichy is a city of 1 million. About 300 to 350,000 people are using toilets of this kind. Either they were defecating in the open or using toilets where they had no idea what was happening underneath. When they do realize something is happening, it's normally because the toilet is overflowing, at which point a truck will come and pump the stuff out and they'll go dump it somewhere, okay? Now, we were working on, look, how do we fix this and so on. And a few interesting ideas came through, which are now under various measures of implementation. Number one, it is possible with a decentralized system of sewage waste handling to, at a pretty low cost, with 5 or 8 centers around the city, manage the daily load of the entire city. Now, the entire project cost would have come, I don't recollect the exact number, but let's say 10 crores. A crore is 10 million, so rupees 100 million. would have been enough to run a gravity flow based treatment plant. Now this is not very attractive because there's not a large number in city corporation terms. The second thing we realized that for a house to build a proper holding tank, since I'm not on sewerage network, it's going to cost about 35 to 40,000 rupees, right? Now the big problem is the minute I'm saying informal housing is a euphemism for slums in many places, and Trichy slums are extremely clean slums. It's a very clean city. I don't have the money for it. If I do have the money for it, as is the case in some parts of Trichy, I don't have title to the land. You know, why will I invest 40,000 rupees into something that I could get kicked out the next day, theoretically, which is typically a problem in all cities. Now, where people can afford the 40,000 and land is not a problem, they obviously don't have the capital up front for it. Microfinance institutions lend for up to 3 years. There's an RBI guideline that says you can lend for more than 3 years. Now, building a proper toilet is no different from building a house. You get a housing loan for 15 years. You get a toilet loan for 3 years. The repayment on 3 years is too high for somebody to afford. But it's possible that if I treated it like a housing loan and bundled my toilet construction with collection, I could end up with a monthly fee of around 150 to 200 rupees for a household. Now, a household typically has 4 members who pay a rupee each to use a community toilet every day. So they're anyway spending about 150 rupees in a month for something like this. They wouldn't mind spending a little more. So it's possible pretty much like it is in the telecom sector, where I bundle different aspects of the services, number one, to make it affordable to the citizen, put in a commercial framework, and that commercial framework is attractive enough for a different kind of player to come in. Now, like it or not, in India, very few of our profile of people are going to get into a business that's about collecting potty from a household. It's not going to happen, right? If you look at the profile of people who are actually doing the work, and let's face it, this is the reality. I mean, I've been talking and meeting these people over the course of the last year as well. They're very happy to upscale and make a more profitable business. They need help from bigger financial institutions around a construct that allows them to make money. Now, what's also nice is that many of these services that currently function, there are already services functioning in every city, by the way, including, I'm pretty sure, in Jaipur. They work on a competitive basis. They are not looking at any government subsidies. The guy gets his truck, his workers, he comes to your house and cleans the place up. So the idea of bundling and unbundling services to create different kinds of projects that may not on the face of it look like PPP, but once you construct the project, it's amenable to somebody else taking on the load. So the government can focus the thrust of its funding efforts on where there is no commerce at all. So that's the second thought. The last thought I have, which I want to leave with you, is when we construct PPP projects, and I've been part of teams where we had lots of discussions on this. It's a little borderline on ethics or morality, as you'd like to call it, which is sometimes the objective of the exercise is to make greed work so that some good public outcome happens. I'll give you a specific example because I had a parallel to this that I talked to the Delhi City Corporation about several years ago. I think about 8 or 10 years ago in Bangalore, they upped the fine on drunk driving. Bangalore is a big drinking city, you know, king of good times, etc. And there were lots of accidents happening and people were getting killed for completely stupid reasons. And citizens are very active, and so they equip the police guys with their breathalyzers and so on. Now, unlike the traffic electronic guns, these breathalyzers are not, you know, directly linked and so on. So what happened after the fine was hiked is the fine went up from 300-400, which the guy would charge, to officially to 5,000. And then you lose your license. So effectively what happened is that the bribery levels also went up. So you were still not paying the fine. You were still bribing the cop. However, at $1,000 bribe, you said, man, I might as well take a cab home, right? Now, the public outcome for you is you don't want drunk people behind the wheel of a car. The public outcome is not to increase the drunk driving fines. You want to reduce the drunk driving incidents. And that's something that's flattened out over 4 or 5 years. A few years ago, when we were looking at construction debris disposal in Delhi, and we got into a conversation with the city corporation who accepted our argument on this, is to do something similar for disposal of construction debris. It's pathetic. But a person will spend, like many of us, maybe 10, 15, 20 lakhs on building a house. They will not spend 5,000 to take the waste that comes out of the construction to dispose it off at a proper place. Now we suggested, why don't you look at a fine? The equivalent of the 5,000 for the drunk driving, where the bribe becomes so costly, you might as well call a truck to take it away to a designated place. So one of the aspects of structuring, and again, as I said, this is, you know, if I put this up before a government program on official paper, they will throw me out. And at some point, the officer concerned will be, you know, hauled up in front of the media on, you know, how can you run corruption, etc., etc. But the fact is that you want a public outcome. And some ways, rather than pretend that we can convert citizenry to monks, let's assume we're all crooks. But through our crookery, can we do something good? So those are some of the thoughts that I have on the innovation on operationalizing PPPs. I will now hand over to Dr. Mayaram to kind of sum up in a sense the session and add his thoughts.
Thank you. I think we have fairly run the entire spectrum of what could be or could not be. And before we throw open to the audience for their comments, I'll just like to mention a few things that already in the space of public-private partnership, tremendous amount of innovation is happening. But we have never captured it as innovation. We look at it as business as usual and then we move in accordingly. One of the programs which, pilots which Prasanna and I were together doing, working on it for a while, what he mentioned was Pura, how to integrate the different. And one interesting aspect which came out was that it had all the elements, and we were talking about rural areas. So we are talking about communities living in rural areas. How do you provide urban amenities to rural areas? And this program that we evolved had all the elements of PPP. So it has service level standards, for instance. So it had a concept of independent engineer. It had the concept of performance guarantees. It had the concept of default. So this was a complete package which was to be delivered to the rural area. Now the interesting question which came was, a typical concession agreement which you sign off is about 150, 200 pages, which is all legally drafted. It's a very strong legally drafted because it can be adjudicated in a court of law. Now, if a sarpanch of a panchayat has to sign a concession agreement with a private party, with all these elements inside there, and these are written in English because our laws are administered in English mostly, the contract law is. This sarpanch who's living in the village may not be able to understand what is written there, may be shy of signing a document, afraid that someday he might get into trouble. So they will not be able to sign this. And so there was this innovation came in through one of our associates from the J. Sagar associate. He said, why don't you do this? We make first 15 pages which are in vernacular, project specific to that village, and rest of the document becomes like a FIDIC document, like you have these insurance papers and so on, which gets attached as part of, to be read as part of the contract, which is approved by the cabinet of the state or something, so it indemnifies the sarpanch from signing something which he will get into trouble. And this solution was beautifully implemented. The model draft document was prepared in this manner. Now this was an innovation which can have far-reaching impact when you are looking at contract relationships in these rural areas where people are not so well versed with either English language or with the legal requirements of contracts. I'll also like to speak of another very interesting innovation which evolved. When I was in the Ministry of Minorities, we discovered that the minorities, especially the Muslims, the school dropout rate is very high. and after fifth or fourth or third or fourth or fifth, or they go to madrasa education and they're thrown out. But there is a requirement under labor laws that they cannot be employed in organized sector unless they have a class 8 school leaving certificate. So obviously this huge number of young people cannot get into organized sector, so will continue to live in unorganized and will continue to have to live in that kind of a situation. So a new design of public-private partnership was evolved, in which school education and skill were combined, so that over a period of 10 months, an accelerated education program was put in place with the latest audiovisual and other equipment to be used for teaching purposes, at the end of which and 3 months of skill training was included in it, at the end of which the student which went through this 9-month course would be given a skill certificate and also a certificate of 8th from the open school certification program. And it is working actually. Already 15,000, this is about a year and a half, 2-year-old program. About 15,000 students have come out of this kind of a training program and have benefited from it. And interestingly, 50%, almost close to 50% are girls who have come through this program. Now this is run purely through public-private partnership because the kind of innovation in teaching which is required was just not simply available in the public sector. Now similarly, I would also like to speak about the other one, which is in terms of the drinking water and sanitation in rural areas, a project CIRC is presently doing in the state of Orissa. The government statistics show that under Swachh Bharat, which has been spoken of earlier also, only 6% of the toilets throughout the country which have been constructed are connected to water supply. So 94% of the toilets which are constructed do not have water connection. And therefore, most of these are used for storage purposes. They are not being used as toilets. So we have constructed toilets, but they are not being used as toilets because there is no relationship between the drinking water connection which comes into a village and the sanitation program which is being run. And so we are creating a public-private partnership format for the state of Orissa, for some of their, as pilot project for their larger places, where drinking water, sanitation, water recharge, because you are mining water from the ground, recharge and disposal of sewage at the end of it through decentralized sewage. All of these are combined together or bundled together to be delivered as a service. Now this is a PPP innovation which is happening. So there is tremendous amount of PPP innovation already happening in India, and I'm sure it's happening in other countries also, which in the end is going to benefit the end users. So I think starting from what Professor Morris said, there is a problem of the manner in which we look at the grand strategy of doing things, because these are things we can do separately or independently, but do we have a big strategy that we can put in place where PPPs fit in well to be able to deliver, as it was done in the case of NHDP? Or as Sharmila has said, that how a large number of policy initiatives have already come in place trying to put these things together. Perhaps much more needs to be done. And then of course the innovation that Prasanna was talking about. But I would like to, in the end, only sum up by saying that we'll need to watch and be mindful of 3 factors which I think again and again will come in the way of either introducing innovation or being able to move PPPs to a bigger scale. The first is the absence of the acceptance of the principle of a learning curve. Whenever you do new things, there is a learning curve, and that learning curve would mean that we will be making mistakes on the way going forward. And unless we have that acceptance that while we are going forward, there will be a learning curve and there will be different So you cannot go back, which the Supreme Court and other courts have done now, to rectify some mistake committed in 2008 or 2007, because then that upsets the entire process. Then we will not be, if we don't accept that there is a learning curve principle, we will not be able to move forward very well. And out from that emerges the second principle, which I think in India we are tremendously plagued with, both at the society level, at the government level, at the judicial level, at all levels, which is this whole principle of zero tolerance to failure. So the moment one project get bombed, 5 projects will get bombed. So out of 60 or 70 coal block allocations which take place, 5 of them are flawed. The Supreme Court goes and cancels all 60 of them. And then you have this huge overhang of investment, investors getting hurt, lenders getting hurt, and others getting hurt. We have to understand there are going to be failures. System will fail, projects will fail, promoters will fail, lenders will fail in what they're doing. But that does not mean that we can stop moving forward. And therefore, we have to accept certain tolerance to failure in that sense. And finally, we also have to we have to give up, even though I have 2 people here from Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, who strive for perfection all the time. But I think we'll need to give up the quest for perfection in designs. So best can often be the enemy of good. And because we strive to get only the best all the time, we are not even being able to get the good out of it. And this is where I think what Sharmila said was right. We were all party to that great mistake of thinking that the world would always be very good, that we are on a roll and for the next 50 years, India is going to grow at 10% per annum. So we created such perfectly rigid system of PPPs that we ended up into having a lot of trouble with them. So I think if we are mindful of these 3, I think we can move forward with PPPs for much greater innovation in public services, especially in the delivery of what we would say sustainable development goals for India. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Myra. Any comments, observations, and questions? I have a request. Please introduce yourself and as brief as possible so that more people can, join in the time. We've got about 15 minutes left.
From the Foundation for Effective Markets. I think this session has been a very powerful one, but I'd just like to bring to you an illustration of one of the serious problems. The last speaker spoke of the failure to connect water to new toilets in many developing areas. Well, just earlier this week, I spent a couple of days down in the south at Kunjakir, a little village just near Chittorgarh. And there had been there a village of 1,600 people and quite a large rollout of built PPP toilets to replace many of the open toilets that are still used there. And as he described, there's no water connected to them, and so they're quite useless. In fact, the problems of that design were ones that are very common to PPPs. We spend so much time talking about financial instruments, obligations, supply arrangements, and things like that. And who is left out? The people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries. I went also to the block development office to ask them how this could happen and how that worked, and that all of the arrangements were upward facing to the government, to the funders, to the contractors, all of those. There was, so far as I could determine, no village participation in the decision-making, delivery or evaluation. I'm just ending by saying none of this will ever work unless we find a way of institutionally building in the residents, the consumers, the customers. And CUTS knows about this. It has the Centre for Human Development down there. And one outcome, I hope, from this session might be that, that CUTS will argue to institutionalise genuine community participation in all such arrangements for the future.
Thank you, sir. Yes, please, the gentleman at the back on the right. I will come to you. Introduce yourself and your point quickly, please.
Yeah, I'm Madhav Dar. I'm a competition economist, and I just wanted to make a observation about the point Mrs. Sharmila made about renegotiation. And I was thinking that perhaps at the stage where, you know, the public delivery, the machinery has to be set up, at that point, perhaps you need to rethink this proposition, because long-term contracts are often beset by, you know, gaps and missing provisions. And in fact, last year the Nobel Prize for Economics was given on this whole literature. So it may be useful to think of renegotiation there. And you know, all the insights of that literature can be used in actually devising contracts. And of course, it's very nice that PPP is going well.
Thank you, sir. Okay, the lady at the back on the left. Yeah, please. I come from. Yes, please.
Hi, this is Priyanka. I'm a research fellow at the National University, Delhi. So my question is, open innovation is a concept that has been gaining considerable attention in recent years, and that firms increasingly worldwide across sectors have been practicing, or they claim to be practicing it. Do you think open innovation can play a role in public-private partnerships to further the sustainable development goals?
Thanks a lot, ma'am. Perhaps I'll just gather all the questions and you can kind of answer at the end. We shall keep that, open innovation. Yes, please, the gentleman. Yeah, please. Sir, you just have to wait for your turn. Give me a minute.
Hello. Hi, I'm David Rosario. I'm a lawyer from the Philippines. My question is more on the way to hold the government more accountable for public-private partnerships. Just to give a bit of context, in the Philippines, we do have some major PPP projects. One of the biggest ones was with regard to an airport. It took place in one administration, because administrations in the Philippines, it's roughly 6 years. Every 6 years they change governments. But these projects, they tend to be longer. So what happened was the project was awarded in one government, and when they changed the government, the losing bidders for that project, they complained, and the government threw away the contract, and that led to 15 years of arbitration and judicial dispute. And only after 15 years, that's when they decided, okay, the government did breach its contract. And now, just last week, our government terminated another major contract, and that's probably heading into another decade of judicial dispute resolution and arbitration. So I guess on the strength of this whole idea that justice delayed is justice denied, my question is, are there more efficient ways to hold governments accountable for breaches of contract, aside from, I guess, the normal routes of arbitration and judicial dispute resolution? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll sum up the questions later. Yes, please, there was a lady in front. Smitha, you want to ask a question as well?
Yeah, I raised my hand.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you were buried behind the camera guy.
No,
so
the camera's coming
please.
later. Prasanna, my point is very simple, that I think as Alan Asher noted this, he visited some of our areas, and he found these discussions that took place very rich. Perhaps, and I found Sharmila would like to, some of the points which you made in terms of your own experience as Joint Secretary in the Government of India's Department of Economic Affairs looking after PPPs, is the website that you created. How do you think the international participants, like we heard that very sad story from Philippines, and that kind of thing happens in many developing countries. How could they benefit from, your experiences, or Prasanna, your experiences? Could CIRC think of a platform for an international forum of this kind? Now, Arvind, I may like to mention to you that, see the design that you've taken is people's first PPPs. Now, particularly in many projects which involve people directly, like water utility projects. In Africa, following the structural adjustment program, many of these water utilities were privatized. In Zambia, they took a very intelligent decision, following the model which Arvind spoke about, is to set up a water users group to work with the developer together. On the contrary, there was a contrarian example in South Africa where nothing like this happened and there was a lot of uproar. So, these are the kind of things which we need to inculcate in design of PPPs for the developing world. So, some of the points which you colleagues made were excellent. And if you could, draw out lessons for other developing countries in that, it would help in this kind of conference. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. I think, yes, please, the lady in front, the young lady in front. Yeah, please.
Good afternoon. I am Priyam Purohit from Cuts International. As Ms. Chavali had rightly pointed out, that dispute resolution is a key aspect that one needs to, in India, we need to strengthen and improve on. So my question is that can we think of setting up an independent regulatory authority for PPPs per se, so that the dispute resolution mechanism can be further strengthened? And if yes, then what are the contours of that? An ideal independent regulatory authority for PPPs.
Thanks. I got that question. Sir, yes, please.
Says the Samson. I'd like to ask a question. What would be India's response to the UK society? Recently, the spokesman for the Labour Party in the UK made an announcement that PPPs has been such a disaster in the UK that a Labour government coming into power would cancel all the PPs and repatriate them back into the various ministries. The Institute of Economic Affairs did a calculation and came up with the figure of somewhere between $60 to $100 billion that it would involve the government in paying off those contracts. And when he calculated the impact on that on the debt burden, he modified his statement and said, it's only the PPPs that didn't work. He would take over. I'd like to hear your response to
okay, no, we've got that. We've got two. What do you do when you run into problems and there's a cancellation? What do you do when a government decides they want to dispense with PPP? There's one more gentleman at the back. Yes, please. Your question as well. Then I'll hand it over to the panel to respond to all.
Thank you very much. I am from CSTV. I have very good thank you to Dr. Arvind Mayaram. He mentioned about the zero tolerance. How to make a more zero tolerance society in Indian country where different culture, different society, different norms are there. How to be integrate all this in a better way to zero tolerance society.
Thank you for that last observation, sir. Let me just summarize the questions before I could go to each of you by turn. The first one was, how do you sort of build an open... There were at least 3 of the participants who asked about the risks associated with cancelling contracts, typically with change of government. The gentleman here mentioned in the UK Labour Party member saying, I'll cancel it. The gentleman from Philippines said the contract got cancelled. Is there some way we can handle this, contractual fulfillment and the risks associated with that? A young lady opined as to whether it would make sense to have an independent regulator who looks at just these contracts. These 3 were all regarding political risk, cancellation of contract. Pradeep and the gentleman at the back had talked about integrating communities into designing the program to start with, and cited examples of two different kinds of programs, which were a central privatized versus a very community-based programs, both of which have had varying degrees of success or could succeed as well. So your opinions on that. And of course, the gentleman last mentioned about looking at zero tolerance. In fact, I think he was just echoing your view that you need to be a little more tolerant of failures. By turn, if would you like to start? Yeah, why do you, Dr. Mayram?
So let me start with that, which is the most contentious, about what happens if the government cancels contracts. And also this whole issue about UK, in UK the Labour Party now demanding, I mean announcing that they will cancel contracts. Very clearly, if the sovereign so decides to renege on its promise, there's very little one can do. We must be very clear about this, because the foundation of governance is that the sovereign is responsible to those who it governs, and which includes people who have come in and put their trust in the government and provided services and so on. So there is nothing you can do, but it's bad governance. It's bad governance. It erodes the credibility of the government. It has a very long-term damage on the manner in which governments can be effective, not just in PPPs, but in anything, because then people begin to look at them with suspicion. So I think it's bad policy, it's bad governance, it's bad principle to do something of this nature, to say we'll take back. Now, Labour Party could certainly say, in future we shall not. Then there is no problem. Because you are saying that in future we will not give any PPP contracts, that's our stated policy, and there is no issue with it. But to say if a PPP is going on and we will take it back from the private party, I think that is bad policy. But we must make a distinction between PPPs in countries like UK, where it's more like a public finance initiative, and in countries like India or in developing countries, where we are not looking at only lease back of infrastructure. So in UK, for instance, a school building is constructed and maintained by a private party, but the teachers, the principal, the curriculum, and everything else is public. Government pays salaries to the teachers and does everything. They construct prisons, but the guards and everybody else is that of the government. So they do this kind of a, public finance initiative, which they are calling PPPs. But in India, what we do is we are actually saying we don't have so much of a problem, even though we have resource constraint in terms of construction, but the problem is in terms of maintaining it and providing a certain level of service. So the service provision becomes more important part of the PPP than the physical asset itself. So services are embedded. Mostly, I'm saying, there might be some exceptions, but mostly the services are embedded in the infrastructure asset which is created by the private party, and therefore we are talking of service level standards, not in terms of the physical maintenance of the infrastructure itself, but in terms of the service delivery that is done. So how much water will be given, what would be the periodicity of water supply, what should be the quality of water provided. It all gets embedded in the PPP contract itself. So there's a difference in that kind of thing. So I think we need to make that kind of a distinction.
Quick comments from, I've been told we've already overshot by 10 minutes, so quick comments on the queries that have come.
Yeah, I think on open innovation, I'll just say that the potential is enormous, because particularly developments in IT, feedback of information, what Google does, aggregating tiny bits of information that an individual generates when he's on the road with his mobile phone into a feedback which tells you, which roads are getting congested. See, these kind of things have the potential to change the boundary between what is, where there's market failure and where there isn't. Given technology of the past, we believe that certain things have market failure and therefore they are in the public domain. It may not remain so in the future if some of these innovations happen, actually. So there is enormous potential. There's enormous potential in terms of consumer feedback, consumer involvement in PPPs, in public services, and so on, which can be brought in with, IT-enabled kind of innovations. But they need to fit in the right place. Yeah, now, on this bringing in consumers, I will say that, bringing in users and consumers is perhaps the most important thing in the design of PPPs. I would think that the government must first start with understanding what is the consumer value, what is the public value. See, when I say consumer value and social value, there are two aspects to the social value. One is the private value, which we'll call the consumer value, and the other is the public value. If there is one thing wrong in India, we are slaughtering public value everywhere. Okay, our roads are great, but since they don't take you to the middle of the city, or there is a huge problem there, you may have a good ride on a highway, but end up losing time on either ends. That's just one example. I mean, there are so many ways, design issues in urban areas where public value is slaughtered. So I would think bringing in the consumer is very important. The question is, do you do it at the design stage or do you leave it to the vendor or the developer? The answer is actually you conceptualize it much earlier, okay, if you want to really build it in. Now, on the small point about contracts and renegotiation and cancellation, all I'll say is that if PPPs are derived not out of a specific executive action, but they're derived out of a larger law, okay, then the risks are somewhat less in government annulling such contracts. But I think what is getting missed in the whole discussion is the endogenous risk. Okay, these can be lowered with changing times if two things are taken out, which is what I was arguing for: interest rate changes and price changes, where in those inputs which are very major, such as coal in electricity, gas in electricity, and so on. Okay? So if payments, either annuity or toll or whatever, are in some way linked to certain key indicators of prices, a lot of contract failure risk will go down. Okay? So that is what I would say. Today, the reason for the Labour Party to worry about this is there's a huge, in some of those projects, huge premiums that, just because of price movements in the direction that has favored the developer, and he does not want to move from that. That's why they're thinking of cancelling those contracts. Now about, would not PPPs fail? What is the role of PPPs in India? I would say that it's much, much larger than elsewhere in the world, and we need to get this right. And the kind of developments which have happened all over the country need to be put together. Broad lessons need to be learned, principles need to be brought in, because to improve state failure at the lower level would be even more difficult. But there is nothing better than improving governance and improving the capability of government. But that should not happen. So I'll just stop here. Just one more thing. The potential of direct consumer in irrigation, sewerage, water, okay, and sanitation and road transport in urban areas is extremely high. Okay, particularly in irrigation, where we are not even thinking about. All the canals of the Narmada system can be completed overnight, in my belief, if you can create a via media to bring the farmers as owners of the canal system.
I'll keep it very brief, Prasanna. Very quickly, water user groups, water user associations and self-help groups are being used extensively in Madhya Pradesh when we are doing water projects over there. But to the participant from Philippines, the question he'd asked, I just want to add a little bit to what Dr. Mayaram had said. How we try and address mitigation of such risks is a very transparent bidding system, so that there's no problem with the system itself and selection of a party. Most important, very highly deterrent compensation payments if there is a termination of the contract, premature termination of the contract before it is due. Very, very onerous, and also responsibility fixing in the government. So unless there's a very valid reason, that becomes a procedural way of mitigating that. The gentleman had asked about, taking the latest economics kind of principle of building in changes later. In a PPP contract, that's not very healthy. What happens is any additional task you give or a deliverable that has a cost, and that in some way affects the base financial model on which the contract was awarded. So you have to be very careful when you build in renegotiation triggers. So that's something that we did assess when we were studying it. Third, I think Mr. Mehta had asked about how we help others in picking up on what we are doing. Our website has tremendous, it's a minefield of information. We have green books, we have manuals, we have dashboards that cover the gamut. I mean, it covers everything from how to conceptualize a project. It has best practices, what we have learned, and what we've done wrong in certain projects. We try and revamp this very regularly. This is Dr. Mairam's brainwave. He wanted a repository of all concession agreements in the country on that. At last count, I think we had got 162 concession agreements. They're available, anyone can go and see them. Please use it. And I think the greatest number of hits we get on our website, both on pppinIndia.com, .gov.in, and in infrastructureinIndia.gov.in, from research students both abroad and here, over 7,000 that we get, I think, on a daily basis from there. So it is doing very well. There was a question on the dispute resolution process. This is, if you go back to the budget announcement of 2 years ago, precisely what you said is what we had in mind. Judiciary also finds it sometimes difficult to understand a PPP concession. Sir had spoken about a document being huge, sometimes 900 pages. It isn't a simple EPC or a rate contract. So one of the requirements in the draft that we put up was that the judiciary will be assisted mandatorily by a panel of experts. And how it will be done, it's now up to the government because they're now processing it. They will have these experts. They will have experts from the PPP side who will help them. And there is a structure. Let it come out, and then we can, it'll be open for public consultation also.
Thanks a lot, Sharmila. I think we can wrap up this session here. Hopefully, it's provoked some thoughts amongst all of you in the context of specific things you're handling. Thank you very much, Professor Morris, Sharmila, Dr. Mayaram, for sharing your thoughts. And we could do any follow-up conversation later. I'm sorry we've overshot by about 15 minutes. That's my fault. Thank you.